Good afternoon. Thank you all for joining today. Really appreciate you taking the time this early afternoon to join us. My name is Mead Binhammer. I'm the board treasurer for AVCC. Before I hand it over to Kevin to give the presentation today, I just want to go over a few quick housekeeping items. You're welcome to keep your camera on or off, but we please ask that you mute yourself during the presentation to minimize any background noise and distractions to the presenters. You can write your questions in the chat throughout the presentation, or you can hold them until the end. We'll have some ample time for questions periodically. So the AVCC is really proud to partner with Vermont Center for Ecostudies on this webinar about vernal pools. They're temporary but really important wetland ecosystems that reappear in our forests every spring. We strongly encourage interested Conservation Commission members to participate in one of the field events that VCE is hosting across the state this spring. More details about that tour can be found on our website. The link and the tour dates will be posted in the chat. Alex will probably wait until after everyone. Oh, there it is. So please click that. You can find the link and tour dates for vernal pool tours in the field where you can get a little more hands-on. Allow me also to take this opportunity to thank Vermont Center for Ecostudies for sponsoring our tiny grants this year. We're planning to disperse up to around $6,000 for Conservation Commission-led projects in the broad categories of land conservation, education and outreach, stewardship, management, and planning. For those of you representing conservation commissions on the call, the submission deadline is next Saturday, April 11th, and we hope to receive applications from many of you. More details about the application process, including evaluation criteria, templates, and success stories of previous applicants, can be found on our website. And we will also post a link to that in the chat. So our main presenter today is Kevin Tolan. Kevin is a staff biologist at the Vermont Center for Ecostudies. He originally joined VCE in 2019 as a member of Eco AmeriCorps and currently splits his time between vernal pool and avian research. He's worked with local conservation groups and community members to map and monitor vernal pools across the state of Vermont. So thank you so much for joining us, Kevin, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm happy to be here, and thanks for tuning in. Let me just share my screen. That look good, I assume. I'm just going to go ahead, and if it isn't, I'll figure it out when you start yelling at me to stop. Well, thanks so much for coming. As mentioned, I'm from the Vermont Center for Ecostudies. I'll just give you a quick background information on us if you're not familiar. We're located in White River Junction, right on the Norwich border. We really focus on bird, pollinator, and amphibian conservation and research. Some of our projects you might be familiar with are common loons. If you've ever seen anything about loons getting iced in and rescued, that's our organization doing that in partnership with the state. We do some bird monitoring, we do some bee monitoring of a butterfly atlas going on. But I'm just going to dive right into vernal pools because I got a lot to cover. Vernal pools are, I'll go on in and define them in a second, but I think a lot of people have probably seen what might be a vernal pool. Vernal pools are areas in the forest that fill with water. You break down what a vernal pool, the name means. Vernal means spring and pool means pool. So usually these are bodies of water that fill in the spring with snowmelt. I'm not going to spend a whole ton of time on the natural community definition, but just so we're all on the same page of what is and isn't a vernal pool, one of the major traits of vernal pools is that they're hydrologically isolated. So that means that they do not have a permanent inflow or outflow. They also usually don't intersect with the water table, so they're not usually fed by groundwater, and they tend to dry every summer. This is extraordinarily important because this keeps the predators a lot lower. Obviously, if the pool is not connected to permanent water and it dries out every so often, fish can't live there. Additionally, insect diversity, especially predaceous bugs like water scorpions or diving beetles, their diversity is generally higher in bodies of water with longer hydro periods. So a permanent pond likely has more invertebrate predators as well. The lack of these predators makes them ideal nurseries for some species. I'll spend a couple seconds talking about the species we really focus on, but just know that the key to vernal pools is this lack of predators, which allow species to breed there. I'll also say quickly what is not a vernal pool. Um, Farm ponds usually aren't vernal pools. Neither are marshes. They might have amphibians breed there, especially things like bullfrogs. But just as far as natural community goes, these are not considered vernal pools. They're usually fed by groundwater or elsewhere. Some other traits that make them more of like a marsh or a swampland instead of a distinctive vernal pool community, which is a very specific type of community. I'm gonna When I say vernal pool species, there are really six species in Vermont I'm primarily focusing on. Four amphibians, probably the most familiar ones yep, being wood frog top left and spotted salamander in the center. Jefferson salamanders are a bit more range limited. They seem to really like calcium-rich bedrock. They seem somewhat sensitive to acidity. And so areas like the Connecticut River Valley, some of those hilltops, Snake Mountain, that ridge top near Addison, or near Middlebury, I guess. Those are where I think of these Jefferson salamanders living. Kind of conversely, there's the blue spotted salamander, which is a little bit more of a lowlands species. So sometimes like in lower marshes, in the Champlain River or Champlain Valley, for instance, is where you might find the blue spotteds. The center here, these are called fingernail clams, and that is on someone's palm, so they really are the size of your fingernail. These live in vernal pools, and then when the pools dry out, they dig down into the substrate. So they're really interesting. We have a couple species of them, but one specific species is a vernal pool specialist. And then finally, we have fairy shrimp. And I'll talk a little bit about these in a bit, but these are really cool. We only know of them from around 35 pools in the entire state. So definitely one of our rarest species in vernal pools, but just as a whole. One other species that we look for, but I'm not going to discuss much, is caddisflies, which have larvae in the water. They lay eggs, and their eggs will hatch in streams and in vernal pools. But because they are not a vernal pool specialist per se, in the same way some of these other species are, I'm not going to focus on them too much. So just a little bit on the life history of these species. Depending where you are in the state, they might still be hibernating. Where I am in near Randolph, we did see some movement of frogs earlier. But generally, wood frogs and spring peepers, which I'm not going to talk about either, they are what's called a freeze thaw frog. So they go underground into the frost line and overwinter basically frozen solid as a frogsicle. Our salamanders tend to go beneath the frost line in old rodent burrows or along roots. Sometimes they're spaced along tree roots. And so they go down further, and we kind of call them a mole salamander because they spend 95% of their life underground. The only time they come to the surface is to breed. And these species are all very short-term breeders. In terms of phenology, I'm going to break this down by region a bit. Champlain Valley in orange, Northeast Kingdom in red, and kind of everywhere else in green. They're only really around for a couple weeks. So just using Champlain Valley as an example, wood frogs start to come out in the end of March, and they are really done breeding by mid-April. That's going to be very dependent on things like your elevation, north or south facing, the amount of snow each year. But a lot of sites, the breeding period for something like a wood frog is only about a week or two. And it's similar with the spotted salamanders and other salamanders. They go to the pool, they might spend a couple nights in the vernal pool, and then they will leave the pool and not return until next year. So they start uphill in what we call upland habitat, and then they migrate down to their breeding habitat. Here, just a body of water, there for a couple nights, and then they disperse back to the upland habitat. It's a really cool video of spotted salamanders. They do what's called congressing. They have a congress which is basically they all meet in their vernal pool together, and this is their it's like a mating ball. The males drop packets of sperm, and then the females pick those off the leaf litter. And so only for a couple nights a year you'll see this, and then they will go, and you're not going to see them again. So very short time period to see the adults in vernal pools. But one thing I think a lot of people are familiar with to some degree are the eggs you see in vernal pools. Each of these is one of the four species of amphibian. So with this top left, wood frog, they have the biggest egg mass. I'm not going to get a whole ton into the identification of this just because I have a lot of other stuff to focus on, but I do have some other talks and some materials online that go over egg mass identification in detail, and it is pretty straightforward. You only have four species to know to deal with. Second on the right here, you have spotted salamander. They have kind of a couple different couple different appearances of their eggs. So they sometimes are a bit greener with an algae. Other times they might be a bit clearer. This is similar to wood frog. They can also have an algae. Jefferson salamander down below, they have a smaller egg mass than the spotted salamander. And then blue spotted salamander has the smallest egg mass of any of the species. So they probably go under surveyed to some degree, but they do lay several egg masses per female. So they kind of have more egg masses with fewer embryos compared to a spotted salamander, which usually only lay one egg mass. Finally, I want to talk about fairy shrimp briefly. These are incredible little creatures. They are sea monkeys, or brine shrimp is probably the more common name for them. They are the entire life cycle is within a vernal pool. They hatch shortly after the pool thaws. They will breed quickly, and then they end up dying by the time the uh, the amphibians are hatching, and you have more predaceous invertebrates coming to the pool as well. And then their eggs dry up once the pool does. Kind of like with sea monkeys, you have your eggs for 10 years, you put them in water, and they become reanimated. Similar idea here. They will hang in the eggs, which are technically called cysts, will stay in the leaf litter until the pool refills, and then they'll hatch. They're pretty often confused with mosquito larvae, which are much more common. But they keep in mind that fairy shrimp have this like a salmony pink or salmony orangish color. And also they're just a lot rarer in general. These is all the sites that we've uh, taken samples from of fairy shrimp to identify their species. Only have three species present. E. bundyi is the yellow dots, and that's by far the most common species. E. intraticus, we've only discovered the past 3 years, and that is more uncommon. And then E. vernalis, which you see in the bottom right here down near Brattleboro, we only discovered that pool or that species in the state last year because we just hadn't been taking samples to identify them. That's kind of interesting because that's more common down along the coast. So in areas like Massachusetts, you might see this E. vernalis quite a bit, and then we're getting away from their range. So we're kind of right in the northern portion of their range. And just because I focus on these five or six species, doesn't mean these are the only species that really benefit from vernal pools. Vernal pools are a massive congregation of life. And so you have a bunch of frogs, you'll have the predators as well. So this is from, I think, game cameras. So a mink, and then you have a barred owl and a red-tailed hawk. A lot of species will use vernal pools for hunting or for water or to get away from the heat in the summer. You'll find black bears that will go for swims in vernal pools. And it's been found that uh, they disproportionately will use vernal pools when available. They've done a study in Scandinavia, I believe it was in Finland, which has moose and has deer and has rabbits, and they looked at their vernal pools, and they found that next slide. They found that this is a graph of the number of visits basically of each species. The dark gray is a permanent wetland, and the light gray is a vernal pool. And so between April and September, vernal pools had significantly more use by hares, moose, and deer. Red fox here was not significantly different, but this just shows how important vernal pools are to some of these larger species that dominate the landscape, but we don't really think of as vernal pool specialists. And this is all to say that vernal pools are just extremely diverse and productive communities. You kind of think of them as a coral reef of the forest. They're really small. They have a very outsized impact on their surroundings, and things congregate there just to disperse into the surrounding landscape. And if you've ever walked through the woods in April when it's pretty dry, it's kind of a desert out there before trees have started leafing out and you have crunchy leaves beneath your feet. Vernal pools provide a really valuable resource for species out in the middle of the forest that wouldn't otherwise have access to just standing water. However, like coral reefs, vernal pools are very fragile and threatened. Here's a satellite image from 1991. It's in color infrared. So where you see the bold reds, that's chlorophyll being reflected. So all the red is evergreen forest. The whiter gray area is deciduous forest. This is taken when there were no leaves on the trees. So you're not seeing any chlorophyll returning from the deciduous trees. And you look in the middle right here, and that's a very good signature for a vernal pool. With the way that color infrared works, this darker return is either depression or potentially standing water. And so you can use satellite images to go and try and find vernal pools across the landscape. Fast forward to 2016, and it's now our house, which is not good. But there's not much we can do about it because vernal pools are so small and frequently aren't mapped as well as other wetlands on town inventories and by the state. It's really easy to miss a vernal pool, either intentionally because you just want to pretend it's not there because you want to develop over it, or perhaps you went during August and there wasn't a vernal pool there, so you go ahead and build the house there because you don't even know a vernal pool is present. So we're having this be, again, this is going to be more and more of an issue with some of the proposed wetland rule changes as well. I'm not going to spend a whole time going over this. I'm sure a lot of people are somewhat familiar. But one of the proposed changes to wetland rules in some portion of the state for housing development would be basically removing protections for unmapped wetlands. So in this example, you have both a wetland that is on a map and one that's not on a map, and they're equally protected. Under the proposed rule change in some portion of the state, if it's not on a map, it's not going to have that same buffer protection. Now, because of how hard vernal pools can be defined and how easily they go undetected, this might disproportionately impact vernal pools. And just to kind of show you how important this might be, I'm going to show you a map of Norwich and all the pools we have documented in Norwich. The yellow dots are unconfirmed vernal pools, and the black dots are confirmed pools. Under this law, say Norwich was within one of these housing developments, only these black dots would have protections, even though there's way more vernal pools than just the confirmed pools. And so that's been one of the impetus for me doing this talk and doing outreach with conservation commissions to try and get as many of these pools confirmed and on the state wetland inventory map as possible. The difference between a confirmed pool and an unconfirmed pool usually comes down to one of two things. Confirmed pools need to have confirmed amphibian breeding, so they have to be surveyed during generally April or May, and you have to have landowner permission for them to be fully added to the wetland inventory. That can be a bit difficult to get. I know a lot of us might go on private lands that aren't posted as part of a publicly available trail network, and you might find a vernal pool that you can confirm the breeding of, but you have to actually reach out to the landowner to get their permission directly. And that's something that, from my perspective, coming in from an outsider to towns, can be a bit difficult to get because they might not know who I am or care who I am or want me to be involved at all in their land, but there might be inroads with conservation commissions that can do a lot to try and get these pools confirmed and protected for the long term. So that's just kind of some background on vernal pools and why they're really important. And now I want to discuss pretty much the rest of the time how you can actually conserve the vernal pools in your town and in your region. So I guess the first thing I want to say is that vernal pool conservation is it's not really rocket science, right? Vernal pools are pretty localized. They're not like birds that are migrating thousands of miles away. They are in your on your landscape year round. And so you're just really focusing on the local conservation aspect can go a long way in documenting and conserving these. The first thing you need to do though is know where the vernal pools are. Obviously, you can't protect something if you don't know where it is. And so this is why we came up with the Vermont Vernal Pool Atlas, which is a joint collaboration with Vermont Fish and Wildlife. If you have one of those conservation license plates with the loon, that has helped fund this in some degree through their watershed grant program. And the goal of this is to, one, have a live active map of known and potential vernal pools, but to also give landowners and community members the opportunity to directly contribute their data to it. When you contribute your data to to the vernal pool atlas, it is also going into the wetland database. So if you can confirm a vernal pool through this atlas, it will also get added to the state wetland inventory. So we just kind of act as a node for landowners to help submit this data because it is such a short time period where vernal pools are around. So it's a really fast and furious 2 months that we're trying to map vernal pools. One of the main ways that we have mapped vernal pools, other than with local involvement of pools they might have already known about, was using remote sensing. So one of my big projects this off season was statewide trying to find new potential vernal pools. Looking at this image, if you know what you're looking for, you can kind of see a couple vernal pools. For instance, one I would like to check out this in the middle here. This looks like it could be a vernal pool, but it can be kind of hard to tell, especially if there's like not good quality satellite imagery. So using LiDAR, which is basically a 3D rendering of the ground surface, as well as some other technology, I went through and I found all of the depressions I could. So basically where there was a detection that there was a depression in the landscape where water was going to pool, I went through for every town in the state and calculated these. Then I manually went through and looking at all these, trying to decide maybe that is a vernal pool, probably isn't, so then we can go and field confirm it. This in the past couple months has found over 8,000 new potential pools. So on the left, this is the new pools per 6.25 kilometer squared. This is based on a 2.5 by 2.5 kilometer grid. So that's just the area. And as you can see, it's a good amount. There's still some portions of the state I haven't had the opportunity to get around to yet. If you're in one of those towns and you're interested in trying to map some pools, let me know. I'll get on analyzing your town as quick as possible. But these are all added to the Vernal Pool Atlas, bringing the Vernal Pool Atlas total to over 13,000 new and potential and confirmed pools in the state. And only a couple thousand of those are confirmed. So there's still a lot to go. So the first step with trying to conserve your vernal pools, as I said, is you just got to map them and know where they are. And I think this is a really great project for conservation commissions, land trusts, and other groups. It is a somewhat low barrier to entry. It can be done on your own time, as frequently or as little as you want. And it can be done with a big group or by yourself or with one other person. So I would say to organize a local atlasing effort, the first thing you want to do is to just identify the pools to visit. On the Atlas website, vpatlas.org, I would suggest going to the volunteer how-to page. That'll redirect you to our website, and I have a video going over how to navigate the atlas. It has some cool functions like looking at the tax parcel boundaries. You can determine land ownership using this a little bit. I think it's also really helpful to try and focus on public lands right off the bat because you don't have to worry about getting the additional landowner permission if you're on a public land. Whereas you might need to go an extra step to get landowner permission to visit pools on private lands. Next up is just get out and just confirm the vernal pool. We have a data sheet. It's a front and back, and we also have a mobile app called Survey 123 that acts as a data sheet. They can go to the vernal pool, take an image, say the approximate depth. Is it ankle deep, waist deep, chest deep? Approximate size. Is there a lot of logging in the area? What species do you observe? And then what the landowner permission situation is. And then you can submit that directly to the Atlas. You can either register for the Atlas and submit it yourself, or you can email us for help and we can always put it in on our back end. And then I think that good follow-up to this is once you have a couple of vernal pools in mind, is selecting one to monitor. I'm not going to discuss this too much, but we also have a statewide monitoring project where you visit one vernal pool a couple times a year for, hopefully several years at a time, years and years at a time, um, to help track the population health and the local phenology. And so if you're a town that's really interested in vernal pool conservation and you have a couple on your town forest or on private land, that could be a great thing to also do as a community and continue to build off the mapping that you've done. One thing I do want to mention, because this is becoming more and more of a concern, is you do have to be mindful about bringing pathogens between vernal pools. Amphibians are very threatened by a couple different fungi. Chytrid might be one you're familiar with. We're really concerned about B-sal, which is the salamander version of it, coming to the US through the pet trade. It's already in Europe. So if you're going to go between sites, it's really important that you take steps to minimize potential spread. If you're on your own property and you're on one vernal pool and you walk 100 feet to another vernal pool, I don't think that's a huge worry. I think of it usually as, is it a distance an animal could naturally make? But if you're going to go from a town forest, get in your car and drive to a private forest, I would definitely say you need to disinfect your gear. The most common way to do this is with bleach, which is the sodium hypochlorite right here. Um, this is from Northeastern Amphibian Partners of Amphibian Reptile Conservation. There's a QR code here for their document for more information. You can also use rubbing alcohol as long as it's 70%. And you want to scrub and get all your muck and stuff off, disinfect, allow the disinfectant to do its work, and then rinse it off. Um, Getting the mud and stuff off is really important so that the boots can dry fully. Also, if you go to one vernal pool and you let your stuff dry completely for a week, and then you go to another one, this is not something you have to worry about nearly as much as if your gear is staying wet and you're going from pool to pool in a series of only a couple days. And then another resource I'd suggest is this guide from Maine, the Maine Municipal Guide to Mapping and Conserving Vernal Pool Resources. This is made specifically for townships and other groups to conserve their vernal pools. It goes through everything from detecting vernal pools using remote sensing to organizing a local group to confirm vernal pools to the long-term conservation. I would love to write one of these for Vermont and update it a little bit. I think this is probably from the early 2000s. Not off the top of my head. I actually have a paper copy here. I should look. It's from 2012. So I'd love to do one of these for Vermont at some point. It's going to, of course, time and funding dependent, but this is a resource I definitely recommend checking out. Has a lot of relevance to Vermont. Okay, now that you've found pools, how do you actually conserve the vernal pool? Well, the biggest thing is to one, preserve the vernal pool basin, the actual area that floods. And then two, you have to preserve what we call the amphibian life zone, or the area around the vernal pool where amphibians disperse to outside the breeding season. So the first obvious step is, so number one, as I said, preserve the basin. In general, currently there's a 50-foot legal buffer from development for a basin. As I mentioned earlier, that is subject to change in some areas potentially. But in general, you can't do any development without a permit within 50 feet of the basin. This doesn't apply necessarily to silviculture, so forestry and stuff does not apply. But if you are going to do any forestry near vernal pool, you don't want to allow any machinery into the basin that could make ruts, that could open up a channel outlet to drain water, and it could really mess up with the hydro period. And you also don't want to either add or remove downed trees to the vernal pool. If you're doing forestry activities, you're doing silviculture, and a tree limb falls into the pool, don't remove it, just leave it, but don't go out of your way to add slash and stuff to the vernal pool unless it falls naturally. That could change the water chemistry, and it's just best practice to try and leave things in a natural state. So now from a satellite image from a aerial view, this is what it kind of looks like. You have your vernal pool here, and you have the depression here. So this point estimate, 0.2 areas, this is that basin zone where you really want to really prevent anything from happening. Now you have to worry about the life zone. The life zone is where breeding adults are estimated to spend 95% of their adult life, or that it encompasses 95% of the adult population that breeds within that pool. We recommend a 400-foot minimum. And that is an absolute minimum because that only accounts for breeding amphibians, not those that might have hatched and spend 2 or 3 years to reach sexual maturity and disperse between vernal pools then. So at an absolute minimum, we recommend a 400-foot buffer, again, from satellite image or from an aerial view. What's that look like? You have the vernal pool depression. You have a protection zone, which we recommend having maintaining the highest canopy cover. So perhaps do very minor silviculture within this 100-foot zone, and then the larger life zone going out that 400 feet, 500 feet, you might see different numbers used, where you want to do somewhat light silviculture. And just in a diagram, what this might look like as a before and after. Saying this top left here is the before, it's constantly 90% canopy cover. But once you do your silviculture, you remove 25% of the trees from the 100-foot buffer and remove about 50% of the trees from the greater buffer. This, in theory, will still leave enough shadow on the forest floor to help maintain a moisture level, which is really the important thing. If you remove all the trees on the landscape and the forest floor can't retain any moisture, amphibians are going to have a much harder time living there. I'd say you have several vernal pools on the property. This is also an important thing that doesn't always get consideration. We think about habitat connectivity for things like bear and moose, but amphibians also really need habitat connectivity. Even if you do have several discrete vernal pools, there's still going to be movement at the greater landscape level. As I mentioned, it takes a couple of years, it takes like 3 years for spotted salamanders to reach sexual maturity. And in that time, they might disperse to different populations. And then once they pick they pick their breeding site, this is when they will return to every year. And that's when they start to stay more in the 400-foot buffer. So as I say, again, the buffer zone is very important, but you also need to be considerate. You need to consider that the amphibians will move and don't just stick within the surrounding buffer zone. And you can also kind of imagine if you remove half of the forest, in theory, that's removing half of the population. Of course, that's not a true comparison. But if you remove a significant portion of the forest surrounding a vernal pool, that is going to have real ramifications on the population as a whole. I have one arrow up in the top right here. Imagine there was a vernal pool on this side of the landscape, or say this is where a lot of the amphibians overwintered, and there's a road in the middle of there. That can do a ton of damage to the amphibian populations. Road crossings can wipe out populations in a matter of generations. And so conserving your vernal pools and mapping your vernal pools can also allow for this to be considered when doing future road construction. If you know where a vernal pool is and you're like, well, I'm building a road here, maybe don't, or you can be smarter about it. And I'll give a couple of details of that in a second. But just to show how absolutely terrible road crossings can be for amphibians. I think this is a European study, but just the probability of getting killed by a car on the road versus the number of cars per minute, just 5 cars a minute can have over 90% odds of destroying a toad or newt population. Again, frogs probably a little bit quicker than newts and toads, but again, they are very high probability of getting killed. But then you have something like a rabbit, a hare, and it's much lower just because of how much bigger they are and how much quicker they are. Um, this is all just to show that imagine you're on your old dirt road. How many cars a minute do you see? And then you kind of estimate how bad that might be for the population. I will give a shout out to North Branch Nature Center. They have a statewide amphibian road crossing program, which is awesome. They kind of our counterpart for that. We do vernal pool stuff. They do the road crossing stuff, but it's really part of the same picture of having a holistic view of conservation. And this has been studied actually in Vermont. I think I've cited 2 European studies. Now I can cite one from Vermont. This is at UVM a couple of years ago from Matt, I did undergrad and grad school with. Brittany Mosier is a herpetologist there, and Steve Perrin used to work for Fish and Game for Fish and Wildlife for the state. This was in Moncton, and they compared mortality of a road crossing before and after a underpass was put in place. And after the underpass was put in place, they found over an 80% reduction in mortality. And here's what this looks like. Again, this got a ton of coverage in the media. This is from the Smithsonian Magazine, and this is the Moncton Tunnel. It was put in, I think, partially because of blue-spotted salamanders and some other species. I think maybe four-toed salamander, perhaps. But they were just having massive levels of mortality that were really imperiling this population. Of course, this was expensive. I think it was it was 6 digits. I think a lot of that cost came from because they had to retrofit the road to put this in. But not all road crossings have to look like this. There's plenty of examples from elsewhere, like this on the right here. This is in Amherst, Massachusetts, of just small 6-inch tall crossings that can channel amphibians under the road. And here's 2 spotted salamanders using one of those. And I think these are a great thing for people to really consider in their towns when they're putting in new roads. And in order to do this, you have to have prior data on where the amphibians are. So by knowing where your vernal pools are and ideally getting out a little bit in the spring during the road crossings, this can do a huge amount of good for local populations to try and prevent them from blinking out basically and going extinct, as has happened at some vernal pools I know of. I'm getting toward the end, but I just want to finish on this. I thought maybe it was going to come up as a question. People do ask me about what if I want to create a vernal pool. A lot of research has been done. Here's again a great resource that I would suggest looking at if you're interested in that. Um, I guess the number one point is that people can create very productive vernal pools. It's I'd say most commonly done for remediation if there's like a permit violation or as part of a permit if you're destroying a vernal pool, maybe they'll say you have to build a new one. But it's really important that you get the hydro period correct. Again, the hydro period is just how long the pool is staying full of water. If it's too short, you might create a population sink. If you make a vernal pool and it only stays wet until May, you might have a ton of amphibians going there in April, laying their eggs, dispersing, and then the pool dries out before any can hatch. In theory, a vernal pool has to stay wet long enough, at least once every 5 years, to sustain a local population. That's based on the wood frog life cycle. Basically, they, in theory, get up to 5 years. If a pool is not staying wet long enough at any point during those 5 years, you obviously can't have a sustained population. And when I say wet for long enough, it's going to depend a bit by region, but I've seen 14 weeks as kind of the value thrown around of that being, if the hydro period is greater than 14 weeks, they'll have a better chance of successfully metamorphing and dispersing from the pool. But also, it can't be too long. If you make a vernal pool and it never dries out, you'll start having things like bullfrogs and green frogs move into the pool. And they are fully aquatic, so they stay in their pool year round. They overwinter underwater. And so they can be a threat to vernal pool species and also all the predaceous insects that might be able to overwinter and thrive. So just if you do create a vernal pool, you just got to be smart about it, and do your research so you're not creating a habitat that's just going to reduce the population. I would like to really thank Alex for getting this all organized and Mead, and everyone for taking care of this. I do have a couple events lined up with various conservation commissions. That those links are all on the AVCC website, and I'm sure I'll publicize them more when I have all of them lined up. Still deciding on a time for Burke. I think we don't have a link for the Heinsberg one yet, but I think the other ones should all have links online. My hope for this is getting out to a vernal pool, going over things like egg mass identification, how to fill out the data sheet for vernal pools, and trying to give you the tools to go back to your town and take some type of a leadership role in this. I think that having one person or a couple people that are pushing it forward, getting out on a weekend a month or trying to get out every so often to just knock out some of their local vernal pools in their town forest is really valuable. I think this is something that's really great for you don't have to be a trained biologist to really understand these vernal pools. You don't have to be a trained biologist to know how to train someone else to map these vernal pools. And so I'm really hoping that I can give you something to take back to your town that you can help conserve the vernal pools in your backyard. And just some information for contact. You can reach out for my project email for this, vpatlas@vtecostudies.org. If you want to email me directly, I should have included this, but just K Tolan, first initial, last name at vtecostudies.org. Project website, which has more background information and training materials, the Vernal Pool Atlas itself, vpatlas.org, and then just our website is vtecostudies.org. And thank you so much. I'm sure we'll have time for questions later, but I'm going to pass it back over to the team, and then I think we have one more person that might be
Thank,
talking. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Kevin. Yeah, I won't let you get away quite yet. Just wanted to maybe highlight a couple of questions that were just pertinent towards the end of your presentation there. One is, coming in about fairy shrimp. So what are some characteristics of a vernal pool that might make it more likely to support fairy shrimp? And
Yeah, we don't fully know. I do hope to do more site-specific research to see if we can answer that question. I think one of the major things is they don't appear to be in what we call lower quality vernal pools. They seem to be like cleaner, undisturbed pools. That being said, I have found pools that have them along dirt roads. I have found some that I would not expect to even find an amphibian in. Um, so I think that has something to do with local land use history. Just where did they, 100 years ago, where did they get introduced to? Where did they come from? And did they just stay there? Or I think it comes down to the bedrock a little bit. It seems like if I go back to the slide with the map, especially this E. vernalis, it seems really restricted to the 89 corridor, which has some glacial history in terms of like flooding and glacial lakes. So I think it might come down to that as well. It's something that now that we have all this data is only from the past 2 years or past 3 years. We only knew of one species we had in the state until we started this project. So it's still ongoing, but I'm hoping, yeah, I think to kind of get at what is driving this distribution, and we just don't fully know yet.
great, great. And then one other question, just in reference to sort of creating vernal pools and how other water bodies may function for amphibian breeding. How do you categorize things like roadside ditches for amphibian breeding? Not vernal pools, but they do support herp species breeding. And then also, there's a question in the chat about, pools associated with riverine systems or riparian systems and how those might function for amphibian species.
So it's going to kind of depend on who you ask. If you were a natural communities ecologist, a vernal pool is a specific natural community. If you look in the wetland, woodland, wildland book, a vernal pool is usually like a defined basin with limited trees growing into it and is defined by primarily the species that live there, the animal species that live there. Um, from my perspective, as a very much wildlife person, I have found roadside pools that are probably only there because of the roadside and have had Jefferson salamander eggs. So for our purpose, for the atlas, we would still take those data. Same thing with riverine associated pools. I think on the data sheet there is something like what type of vernal pool is this? And you can say, is it man-made? Is it a forested depression? Is it a wetland associated? So we do have something to try and get at that a little bit. And then also you get to take the question of like man-made pools in Vermont. I think a lot of our vernal pools probably were man-made. We were all deforested, and so maybe they used to be natural vernal pools, then were deforested. Maybe a lot of old farm ponds that have since been reclaimed by the forest and are kind of more like naturalized now. So there really is questions about the origin of vernal pools. And from my perspective, for this project, it gets more to the wildlife that's using them. So roadside pool, you can mark it's man-made on the data sheet, but if you find spotted salamander eggs, I think the spotted salamanders don't really care about the roadsideness of it all.
Well, that's great, Kevin. Thank you so much for answering those. We will hold the rest of the questions until a little later, but before we move fully into that question and answer and sort of discussion portion of the webinar, we have another presentation from Paul Marangelo of the Montpelier Conservation Commission. Paul worked for 20 years as an ecologist at the Nature Conservancy, and he's worked on many similar projects over the years, including a vernal pool mapping project led by the Montpelier Conservation Commission, which was done before the pandemic. He's here today to talk about some of the lessons learned from this work, including both the technical challenges and his experience working with private landowners. And I think this will dovetail really nicely with Kevin's call to action for conservation commissioners locating pools in your town. So thank you so much for being here, Paul, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Mead. I'm going to just share my screen. Go. All right, so this is a project that I worked on. I actually inherited it back in 2023 as part of the Montpelier Conservation Commission. The commission has a history of being interested in vernal pools within the city of Montpelier and has done a number of identification and assessment efforts. And this project was kind of a follow-on to that because at the time, I don't have all these dates completely accurate in my mind because this is 3 years old. I'm in the process of trying to refresh my memory about this particular project, and also just kind of not really been part of it, the development part of the project. I just kind of took on management of it at some point. I don't have all the dates completely correct, but in 2016, the city had identified a number of vernal pools within the city. Sometime after that, some spatial models became available that predicted the occurrence of vernal pools in the landscape using LiDAR data. Two of them that I kind of peripherally know about. One of them was developed by the Vermont Spatial Laboratory, and another subsequent work was based on that Vermont Spatial Laboratory assessment, but kind of refined it, and that was done by Arrowwood Environmental. I don't know how old these efforts were, but I would guess probably 2018, 2020 or something like that. And back before the city flooded and bankrupted, stressed out the city budget, the Conservation Commission had a small budget every year that we could put to things like this. We hired Matt Peters to actually go out onto the landscape wherever we could get landowner permission to verify whether any of these predicted vernal pools were indeed actual vernal pools. That's the front page for the report, and I'm not going to, some of you will probably be relieved to know that I'm not going to be leafing through the report on screen with you all here. But I do have a PowerPoint that highlights a couple of major points that are associated with the outcome of this project. So, as I just mentioned, the project is focused on identifying and mapping, basically using the maps of potential vernal pools and verifying whether or not they were actual vernal pools. And a big component of this was landowner permission. So yes, my next slide will give you a really good example of that. This is a slide of some of the predicted vernal pools in the spatial analysis lab model spread out across a portion of Montpelier. And there are quite a few of them. And to this point, to the date of this particular survey work, the only vernal pools, with a couple of exceptions known in the city, were on lands that were owned by the city, on city parks and so forth. There were a large number of these polygons which are on private lands, so which is basically the genesis of this project. You can see this one area in particular in the west part of the city had quite a few predicted predicted vernal pools. So, you know, as manager of the project, I had collected the names and addresses of all the landowners who owned land that had some of these predicted vernal pools, and we picked a subset of these landowners, the ones that had some combination of either the highest priority predicted vernal pools or a large number of predicted vernal pools. So obviously this landowner list that I created was skewed towards large landowners in the city. Case in point was this group here, which is on this 500-acre parcel on the west side of town. So the numbers kind of look like this. 123 potential vernal pool sites were identified by the models. And we're actually able to visit only 47 of them. And that's because of the 25 high priority landowners are on our list, only 5 granted permission. And that was one of the take homes from this particular project, was that it's really hard to contact landowners and to get their permission once you've contacted them. I basically recorded their address from the grand list and names, and I took the additional step of seeing if I could find an email or a phone number on the internet. And for quite a few I did, and for many I didn't. So I sent letters out introducing the project and myself and a little bit of the objectives of the project to all these landowners. And for those that I had additional contact information, I followed that up with a phone call. So I got a lot of it. Very few were enthusiastic and granted permission. A couple were indifferent and weren't really interested. And one was actively antagonistic. And that was unfortunately the person who owned that cluster of vernal pools up on this area. Which, by the way, I know for a fact that there are vernal pools up there because I have neighbors that hike up there. But they're unrecorded, and they will probably remain unrecorded for the foreseeable future. This particular map is one of the parcels of a landowner who is interested in the project and had a fairly large number of predicted vernal pools on their land. You can see that these predicted vernal pools are ranked high priority, meaning more likely to have vernal pools, and low priority, meaning less likely. Now, how they were ranked, I don't know. I was looking for the background information briefly on these modeling efforts on my hard drive, and I couldn't find any, so I couldn't refresh my memory what these were actually based on. Obviously, a digital elevation model from LiDAR and probably some kind of land cover analysis, but maybe not to the point that Kevin was talking about, where you looked at ortho photos and look see could identify actually any standing water on any of these polygons. So this particular parcel, kind of consistent with what we found throughout the project, only had none of them had vernal pools. As a matter of fact, of all the vernal pools that we visited, 37 of them were false positives, meaning that they were predicted, but there were no vernal pools there. However, the models that we did use, of all the known vernal pools within the city, they were all included in the model. So the models successfully predicted those. Overall, from the overall project, we only found one new vernal pool that was kind of marginal quality. And the last slide I have is basically the Montpelier vernal pool map that's officially on our database. All of them are on city-held lands except this cluster up here, which were previously known, and that was a enthusiastic landowner. This particular one was the new one that we found, and that happened to be some standing water in the spillway from the dam that comes out of brain fart. Those of you who live in Montpelier know what I'm talking about, from the flood control dam up on the North Branch River. So I guess takeaways is that if you use the models that we use, it can be to target landowners. You'll have a high false positive rate. So it helps you a little bit in terms of narrowing your sense of where to look for vernal pools, but not as much as you might hope. And the landowner contact and permission piece is just a big obstacle that's just, inherent in this kind of private lands matrix that we try to do this work in.
Thank you so much, Paul, for that presentation and sort of the tangible side of how to identify vernal pools, but also how difficult sometimes the outreach can be. So that's great. We're now going to take some questions for both presentations. So Alex, if you could add Kevin to the spotlight feature too. I think folks can use the raise hand function to ask a question or continue to post them in the chat. And I'm going to go through and, facilitate some of the questions that came in a little bit earlier. But I'll be monitoring the chat as new questions come in. You can use either the chat or the question and answer function. So this might be a question for Kevin, but perhaps for both of you, which is just about sort of where you find vernal pools. Is it more common to find vernal pools in deciduous forests than it is in coniferous forests, or equal probability in both?
I think the numbers right now would say they're more common in deciduous. However, I think that's biased because you can't use the color infrared imagery for pools in coniferous areas. So I think they're probably underrepresented, but I do think of them as usually more of a hardwood or hard or mixed forest type thing.
And that's a question maybe for Paul too. I mean, in the modeling that you used, were some of those depressions identified in coniferous stands because perhaps it wasn't using color infrared imagery to identify them? Can you recall?
That were coniferous stands, because I didn't actually do the field work myself. I did notice in the report that a lot of the false positives, some were just coniferous depressions that were dry, some were wetlands, some were in the vicinity of coniferous forests as well.
Great. And then, sort of dovetailing on both of those comments, is there somewhere that you can get sort of GIS methodology or guidelines for how to do the mapping process? Maybe Kevin, you can speak a little bit to VCE's process for mapping, but is there a shareable guide that folks can use on their own time to say, look at LiDAR and color infrared and identify pools in their town or their community?
Yeah, I have a code. I did this in R, so I have the code available. I can share that if anyone wants it. There's a couple people that have published peer-reviewed papers with methodology for using LiDAR and color infrared. There's now newer satellites out that use something called L-band, which actually penetrates through leaves. So there's probably gonna be some really exciting updates in that too. But I have my methodology. So we did this 10 plus years ago. There's a report, the Vernal Pool Mapping Project, that was solely using photography, basically. Um, my new version was yeah, done in R, and I can share that code.
And do you have any idea? I mean, in over the years, and Paul spoke a little bit to sort of how accurate the modeling was in his experience going out and field verifying. Do you have data, or is VCE keeping data sort of about how accurate that potential vernal pool mapping has been over the years? And um, yeah, is that something that you can share or that you've been tracking?
Yes, in the original mapping effort, that actually was one of the deliverables, was a report that had broken down by biophysical region, true positives, false negatives, and other stuff like that. So I'll dig that up quickly. I will be doing that with my new pools as well. I visited a couple of them and it seems to be working pretty well, but this I only did this year, so we haven't had a full season to actually confirm pools yet. But any pools that get added to the atlas can then in turn be used for determining if the pool was true or not. Because if you get to a point and it's not a true detection, you can submit a data sheet that says, no, this wasn't a vernal pool.
Nice, great.
Yeah, so that will be done. And then like I said, I'm putting the link to the original report in the chat so people can look at that.
Sure. And then, question for both of you about sort of how to involve groups in this. There's a question in the chat about using student groups, in field trip type settings to verify vernal pools. But I'm also interested, Paul, in how you were able to get, others from the Conservation Commission or volunteers to get out to assess vernal pools. Yeah, if you could speak a little bit to how to engage folks in that work and the field verification work.
Yeah, for me, I think that's a question for people who aren't in the Conservation Commission anymore. I just kind of, this project was just kind of standing out there, and there was a lot more interest and movement in vernal pools in the city and the Conservation Commission between like 2015 and in 2019, and I think there were outreach efforts that were undertaken, and I can't really speak to them because I wasn't part of the commission then. So,
Sure.
Any kind of I don't know, any kind of tools that or just forums that exist in any particular town. Here in Montpelier, there's a lot of ways to get words out, and things like Front Porch Forum, and people, a large percentage of the city are attentive to those sorts of things. However, it's more kind of, it's not necessarily, a lot of the people who show up at those things aren't necessarily landowners of interest. They're kind of more of an education effort rather than a landowner outreach effort.
Yeah, I've done some stuff with schools. It really does come down to how much the teacher or person is interested. I have like times that people like express interest, but it's like I can't just come in for an afternoon and do something with your class. I unfortunately I just don't have the time and capacity to do that with everyone. But like if someone's like, oh, like I want to do a project with my class, could you help me, identify some pools that we could visit or something? I'm always happy to help with that type of stuff. But I do think it is a lot of times local community members really taking interest and initiative in wanting to do it, and then they kind of make it happen more so than necessarily it always happening through groups.
Yeah, that's great. Sounds like a great project for a conservation commission to take on and work with their local school. Um, and two questions here about fairy shrimp. One is, how do fairy shrimp get introduced to a vernal pool, and how do they move, through the landscape? And a second question about sort of the mapping for fairy shrimp. You did note that this is a sort of a recently expanded effort to locate fairy shrimp across the state and identify down to species. But Denise says she didn't see any fairy shrimp on the map in Lamoille County. Is that correct? Have they not been identified there yet?
Yeah, yeah, I mean, they have no native dispersal mechanisms, so it's probably something like a duck lands in a vernal pool, picks up in the feathers or through its digestive system, and brings it to a new pool. or like water floods or something, or maybe or the wind. The wind could pick up dried cysts from the basin and bring those over to a new pool. Um, but that's a good question because they have no means of doing it themselves. Yes, we do not have any known fairy shrimp pools in Lamoille. I think Lamoille might be one of the more underrepresented counties as a whole for vernal pools. Definitely Franklin County is as well. Um, that doesn't mean they're not there. They definitely are. It's just you have to be there right time, be looking closely enough for them and know what you're looking for. They might not hatch every year. Some years it seems like they have a big bloom. Some years they don't. So you could have visited a pool and just not seen them, even though if they were would be there the next year. So we have not found any in Lamoille or some of the other counties, but they are it's just because we haven't looked hard enough. I hope at least, I think.
Well, that's great. Well, I encourage
Oh,
others.
Paul, you're saying something?
And that just added, my mind hasn't completely gone. I vaguely remember some literature documenting fingernail fingernail clam dispersal on the by waterfowl.
Hmm.
Denise has a hand raised with a question in the chat.
Yeah, I just wanted to further that question. Um, I didn't I didn't see a lot of vernal pools on the map. Have you been? Do you know of vernal pools in Lamoille County? Are they, you said they're uh, are there any on any maps that anyone knows of?
Um, so I think one of the issues I had with Lamoille County was that the satellite imagery that they used to be using was not done leaf off. So it might have been a bias done during the initial sampling effort. There definitely are, um, I don't have the number off the top of my head. There definitely are at least a couple hundred in Lamoille that we have mapped probably. It's just that a lot of them haven't been visited yet.
Okay, great. That's good news.
Yeah.
And I just put a link to the VP Atlas in the chat, so you can take a look there, Denise, as well, and see what is already mapped in your area.
Yeah, no, I will say I did see one question about something for New Hampshire with this. There is not currently a one-to-one counterpart. I will say that if you went onto this atlas and added a pool from New Hampshire, there's no reason you can't. I just got most of the funding from the state of Vermont, so I have not been able to put any time into recruiting in New Hampshire necessarily or doing remote sensing. I have put in time doing the same LiDAR analysis that in Vermont. I have in my free time taking that to work for New Hampshire. I just don't have any paid time to work on New Hampshire basically. But if you wanted to go and went over to, you know, Hanover or something and found a vernal pool, there's no reason why you couldn't put it to our atlas. And I do hope in the coming year or two to seek funding through organizations that would fund us to expand into New Hampshire more. And then I did see another question about a Midwest. They actually have a massive project going out right now in Ohio through Michigan. They got a big grant from NASA to do even more high depth or even more in-depth mapping than I've done. I think they call it the like the Michigan Vernal Pool Partnership or something like that. But there is a lot of active stuff going on in the Midwest right now.
Great. And then, yeah, the last question, just about landowner permission for mapping pools and confirming vernal pools.
Mhm.
Paul spoke a lot about sort of how difficult it can be to get landowner permission, but what's sort of the VCE policy about getting pools on the map and confirmed, as far as landowner permission goes?
Yeah, so the landowner permission is just required to fully confirm the pool. So if you don't have landowner permission and you just stumble upon one on land that you don't know the owner of or you don't get permission from, you can still submit it. It can get raised to what we call probable, meaning that it was visited and it likely is a vernal pool. It's just we can't fully confirm it. So you can still add the vernal pools, and I do that quite often. Is I'll add a vernal pool from land that I might not have full permission from. It's just that confirmation point to add it to the official wetland inventory. That's the real hang up for the confirmation for the landowner aspect.
Great. Well, thank you so much, and thank you for providing so many terrific resources. And I really implore folks to get involved and search the VP Atlas and find vernal pools near you. We will be, this meeting was recorded. The presentations are recorded and will be shared on the AVCC website as well as on our YouTube channel. We will also send out an email to all participants and registrants today as a follow-up with some resources, and we can try to compile a few of the resources that came through in the chat to make sure that folks have access to those. So thank you all so much for attending, and I really want to just extend my sincere gratitude to both Paul and Kevin for presenting today. I think we got great perspectives both about vernal pools in Vermont and the ecology and biology of them, but then also how conservation commissions can get involved in the mapping process in your local community. And I hope that folks are inspired to get out and find some vernal pools this spring and experience the magic of spring ephemeral wetlands. So thanks all so much for joining.
Yeah, this is awesome, and I hope to see some folks out in the field. And yeah, as I said, if you have questions about your town map, you didn't see your map get covered fully, shoot me an email. I can help out how I can.
Yes, and lastly, I'll just say too that we have a link in the chat, but we'll be sending around the list of field tour for vernal pool walks coming up, with the first one with UVLT on Saturday, April 11th, another one in Hartford on the 12th, Salisbury on the 22nd, and so on. So we'll be sending that out to all registrants today, and we hope to see a lot of you out in the field to join us for those vernal pool walks.
Great. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you all.